Today, we'll be listening to Dr. Iris Mauss, who will share her thoughts with us on how to measure emotion. Dr. Mauss received her PhD from Stanford University and is currently an assistant professor of psychology at the University of California, Berkeley, where she directs the Emotion and Emotion Regulation Laboratory. Dr. Mauss is an expert in the nature of emotion and emotion regulation, and her work has forged new paths in measuring emotion responding, examining coherence between different components of emotion, looking at the measurement and elicitation of anger, and more recently, examining the pursuit of happiness and its relationship to mental health. So I encourage you to tune in to the very special interview with Dr. Iris Mauss. Welcome, Iris. Thanks for speaking with us today.
Thanks for speaking with me.
So, Iris, I know all of us are very interested to know a bit more about what first got you started or interested in the study of emotion. So could you tell us a little bit about what started you on this journey?
So that's always a tricky one, right, to pinpoint. But I think, so when I first formally started studying emotion, I was doing my master's back in Germany. And basically, one of the things that I was looking at was people's responses to environmental stressors, like noise stressors. And what was really interesting was that people ranged so hugely, with some people literally becoming sick from environmental stress and others just completely blowing it off. And it looked like emotional responses played a really big role in explaining those huge individual differences. And it struck me as really interesting and important to understand those individual differences. That was one of the things that got me started to be interested in the study of emotion. Yeah.
Well, and since you've got started, you've done a lot of really amazing things, and I hope it's okay to ask you a few questions about your research on some of those amazing discoveries. There's many, but I'll start with one. And one of them, I mean, you've really done a lot discussing and writing about the measurement of emotion for all researchers in affective sciences in the field. And I guess I'm just wondering, what do you think is some of the most important discoveries in our understanding of how we go about measuring emotion in the first place?
Yeah, so that actually, it's a really, really tricky question. It sounds very straightforward, right? But it turns out it's one of the trickiest questions, I think, in all of emotion science. And I think one of the important insights that people have had is that actually we can't say, let's measure the emotion response, because it turns out there is not just one emotion response usually. When people are in emotional situations, they have multiple components of responding. Like you might feel anxious, you might also look kind of anxious or nervous, and you might have some physiological response, like your heart is racing, and you also might have a particular brain or central nervous response. And what's really interesting is that those different responses that sort of introspectively seem to all go together, when we look really carefully, they don't really go together. So we can't say, I want to measure anxiety and then just measure someone's physiological state. It doesn't translate into the other components of the anxious response. So I think that's one sort of important and interesting insight there, that there's no one emotional response to be measured. But when we want to measure emotions, we need to measure those multiple components as well as we can.
Yeah, I mean, that sounds absolutely right. I mean, emotions are these complex phenomena, like you're saying, that have these different components: behavior, physiology, internal experience. And I guess the thing that many people wonder is, well, do the tools we have currently adequately measure those, channels of emotion response, or do you think there's important new tools that are needed in the field to really get at measuring what an emotion is?
Yeah, for sure. So let's see. I think we could profit from especially sort of being more mindful that emotions are these multi-component phenomena and that we need to try at least. I know we don't always have the resources and the technology to measure multiple of those components. That's one important point. And I think the other important thing that I think would really help emotion science is to use tools that really capture the dynamically changing nature of emotions, right? Anybody who's been ever emotional knows that emotions can change from one moment to the next. And especially when we try to capture how people feel, so the subjective aspect of emotion, we usually do these sort of one-shot questions where we ask, how did that feel after, say, 5 minutes or 10 minutes of some emotional situation? And that doesn't seem to really do justice to sort of the dynamic nature of emotions. And so if we can develop tools that really let us capture the sort of that dynamic aspect of emotions, I think that would be really great and important. And some of those tools are being used and developed, but I think it's sort of not enough.
Yeah, I can imagine, especially for people in some of the work we've done, where you and I have looked at how people vary across time, and some people sort of, they have their emotions that vary or more variable over time, that capturing the just subtle changes from second to second would be really important in understanding emotions, which are supposed to be, you know, these brief phenomena that just last a couple seconds, perhaps even.
Exactly, and we don't really, most of the time, measure that. Yeah.
Well, you know, you say that most people don't measure it, but one of the things that I also think is so admirable about your work is just how much you've really gone in and started to try to look at dynamic emotion responses, looking at, you know, dynamic experience, behavior, and physiology. It's really paved the way for thinking about this idea of how much our emotions cohere or hang together in a second-by-second way. And so I wondered if you could just share with us some of your thoughts about just the coherence of emotion. How well do they really hang together in a, you know, moment-by-moment fashion?
Yeah, so I think one of the interesting, and this is work that I've done together with James Gross and Bob Levinson, as well as others. What is really interesting here is that we often assume, right, that emotions are more or less monolithic responses. And it turns out that that's not the case, as I mentioned earlier. One person might feel really anxious, but have no physiological activation to speak of. Or another person might look super anxious, but report that they felt no anxiety whatsoever. So these kind of dissociative patterns are really interesting to me. And on sort of a basic theoretical level, it means that perhaps emotions aren't these sort of all or nothing whole organism responses, but rather sort of really subtle, graded responses of multiple response systems. And another thing that's really interesting in here are these individual differences, right? So once we sort of say that there are patterns of coherence versus dissociation, and those patterns differ in a systematic manner across people, we can then ask questions like, well, what does it mean for people's health, for example, if there's a particular pattern of dissociation? So, for example, if I have a consistent pattern of feeling a particular way on the inside, but not showing that in my facial behavior, for example, what does that do? And so some newer research, we've shown, for example, that this pattern of dissociation seems to be associated with worse psychological health. So students who show that particular pattern of dissociation don't go on to be more depressed compared to other students. And they also, and the link there is a social link, because it seems to be that this pattern of not expressing your emotions leads to less social connections and worse friendships, if you will, and that makes sense. So that's one interesting aspect of sort of that notion of emotion coherence, sort of that once we give up that overall idea emotions are coherent, we can begin to understand individual differences in coherence.
So really it seems that understanding how emotions might not exactly tie together is going to give us some clues into health and people's well-being, as you're saying.
Yes, exactly. Yeah.
Well, I mean, speaking of well-being, I mean, one of the things that you've been working a lot on lately and that's got a lot of attention, not just from the scientific community, but also from the broader media, is your work on the pursuit of happiness, where you find that there's this paradoxical effect whereby the more people try to pursue happiness, the less happy in some ways they actually seem to be. I'd just love to hear more about this work, and also just how you thought about measuring happiness, you know, when you try to go about studying something as elusive but as interesting as happiness itself.
Yeah, so let's see. So this is work that I've done together with Maya Tamir, and of course a little bit with you as well as my students, Craig Anderson, and others. And to answer your second question first, how do we measure happiness? I think, again, the idea that we and others have here is that happiness is a multifaceted, really complex phenomenon. So we want to measure it as such. And in our own work, we try to measure it first in terms of its what's called state appearance. So simply, how pleasant do people feel at any given moment in time? How happy are you? And then we also try to capture the more trait-like aspects of happiness. And there's two really important facets here. One is, again, the more feeling or hedonic aspect of happiness. How pleasant do you feel in general? How satisfied are you with your life? And the other component of happiness that psychologists study is the what's sometimes called eudaimonic happiness. And that's happiness in the sense of feeling that you have a purpose in life, feeling that you're living a good life, if you will. So we try to measure all of those. So you asked about our research on the pursuit of happiness. And well, one interesting thing that we discovered is that the more people say they want to be happy, the less happy they sometimes are. And we've looked at that in a couple different ways. One way is in an individual difference approach, where we ask people, how important is happiness to you? How much do you want to be happy? Right? So most people say, yeah, I want to be happy. And then some people say, I really want to be happy. It's extremely important to me. And when we ask people that question, and we also ask them how happy are you in your life, capturing these multiple components that I described, it turns out that the more people value happiness, the more they strive to be happy, the less happy they are. And this goes for both the hedonic and the eudaimonic aspects of happiness. And it's particularly true when people's lives are going pretty well. And this is really interesting because it points to a mechanism by which the pursuit of happiness might backfire. So, especially when my life is going pretty well and I have every reason to be happy, the more I want to be happy, the less happy I am. Now, you could say, oh, these are just correlations. So it could be the other way around, that the less happy I am, the more I want to be happy, right? So to rule that out, we also did some experimental studies where we brought people into the lab, and then we randomly assigned them to either a happiness valuing condition or a control condition. So in the happiness valuing condition, we told people that research has shown that the more happy you are, the more successful you will be. And we tested and made sure that this manipulation really made people believe that happiness is very important and that they should try to be as happy as possible. And then we showed them some film clips, and it confirmed our suspicion that the more people wanted to be happy, the less happiness they actually experienced. And we also were interested in why that might be. And, one hypothesis here is that the more you want to be happy, the more you're setting yourself up for kind of disappointment and discontent with what you have. And the experimental studies confirmed that. So disappointment in your own emotional state mediated those effects of pursuing happiness.
So interesting. I mean, it just suggests that we should try to, in some ways, stop trying so hard to be happy, as a way to becoming more happy, perhaps.
Well, I don't think I would necessarily go that far. Yes, actually, maybe I would go. No, this is a really, really, really tricky question, right? Yeah. What are the implications? Yeah. Should we just revel in our misery and completely give up trying to be happy? And I don't think that's true. I think rather we should question how extremely we pursue happiness. And that's actually exactly what you said, right? Yeah. And sort of just moderate our expectations a little bit. And I also think we need to just think about exactly how we pursue happiness. In another study, we looked at that question, and it seems to be the case that if people pursue happiness in a less self-focused and a more other-focused way, they might be able to circumvent the paradoxical effects of valuing happiness. So all I want to say is I don't think we need to just give up and be miserable. I think the pursuit of happiness is a good and important thing, but it shouldn't be unqualified.
So it's all about how you try to pursue happiness, I suppose.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I think that's true.
Just one other question about this, because it's so interesting. I mean, how do you think about how we should measure happiness moving forward? I mean, it's gotten so much attention lately, and measuring it seems to be one of the trickiest, most core issues at stake.
Yeah, so what I think, like I said a little earlier, I think we want to measure multiple aspects of happiness. So again, just like for emotions in general, I think it's important to try and capture the multiple aspects of happiness. So if we can, I think we want to capture its sort of momentary components. How do people feel moment to moment? How much positive emotion and how much negative emotion do they experience. And then I think sort of when we measure more sort of trait-like stable aspects of happiness, we want to measure both the emotional aspects of it, so the hedonic component, but also that eudaimonic component of happiness that we sometimes, I think, as emotion researchers don't do. So how much purpose do people feel they have in their lives? And that can be, it overlaps with hedonic happiness, but it can also be distinct. So someone who doesn't feel a lot of positive emotion can still feel that their life is very, very happy in the sense of having a good life and a fulfilled life.
So Iris, I have a question then. When you think about, we started with where you first got interested in emotion and had a really nice conversation about all the work you've done so far in emotion. When you think about sort of the face of the future of emotion, what do you see in store for the future of the field of emotion? Predicting the future, right?
Right. Well, I mean, I can describe a couple of things that I would hope will happen. I think one really important hope I have is that we continue looking at sort of the immense diversity of emotions and its effects, so that we continue to look across different cultures, across different groups in the U.S., across different age groups, and so forth. And I think that looking at emotions in those diverse contexts will be really important, both from a basic science standpoint, but also from a more practical standpoint. So I think that's one thing I would hope for the future. I think another thing is that we really need to engage in even more cross-discipline collaborations. And I think the field of emotion science is really good about this, right? Because we recognized early on that emotions have really important health implications. They're really important in economic and political decisions. And I think sort of taking that really seriously, and sort of as most emotion scientists, I guess, are psychologists. So, we need to work together with clinicians and economists and political scientists and
everyone.
Yes. Thank you for abbreviating that.
Yeah.
To really understand, what role do emotions play in psychological and physical health, to really understand what role emotions play in the sometimes seemingly crazy decisions and self-harming decisions that people make about their lives and so forth. So I think collaboration is a really important thing for the future. Yeah.
Well, you're an especially good collaborator too, so it's nice to hear you say that as, a nice way to have the field keep moving to be more like Iris Mauss, a collaborator extraordinaire.
This is it. But.
So, Iris, what advice would you have for students or people more generally who are just embarking now in studying emotion?
I think, I don't know, no really specific advice, but I think it's a great time to become involved in emotion science. I hope that some of the things I talked about sort of made that point that there's so much to discover, both in a really basic sense. There's really interesting questions, very basic theoretical questions, but also lots and lots of important translational science to be done. So I think it's just really important for people to know that there's so much room for new scientists So I would be very encouraging. My advice would be to get on board. Yeah.
Excellent. So getting on board with emotion, I think, what better advice could you have for students, you know? Iris, thank you so much for speaking with us today. This concludes our Experts in Emotion interview with Dr. Iris Mauss from UC Berkeley.